A hand shoved her hard between the shoulder blades. She stumbled off the porch and caught herself on the wet railing. A duffel bag came flying out after her. Then a second bag. Then the door slammed and the lock turned behind her. She stood there in the cold rain with both hands pressed flat against her belly. 7 months pregnant. 21 years old. $1 folded inside her coat pocket and nowhere in the world to sleep that night. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She picked up her bags and she walked. Her name was Mara Ellis. 7 days later, she handed that last dollar to a county clerk, signed a paper nobody else would sign, and walked into a ferryman's hut nobody wanted. What did she find beneath those floorboards that silenced the voices that laughed at her? Stay with me on this one. The hand belonged to Evelyn Harker, Ryan's mother. The house belonged to Evelyn too, and so did everything inside it. And by the time Mara's bags hit the grass, Evelyn had already made up her mind that Mara would not be a part of any of it. Mara stood in the rain for a long time. She waited for the door to open again. She waited for Evelyn to come out and say she hadn't meant it. That was not how Evelyn worked. Mara knew that by now. She picked up her bags and she started walking. Ryan had been gone 8 months. A logging accident out in Oregon. He was 23 when a snapped cable took him off his feet, and he was dead before the saw crew reached him. Mara found out she was pregnant 3 weeks after the funeral. Evelyn had never liked her. Not really, but she had tolerated her because Ryan loved her. With Ryan gone, there was nothing to tolerate. Mara had no family of her own. Her father had drunk himself into a grave when she was 19. Her mother, she had not spoken to in 4 years. There were no aunts to call. No cousins who would pick up the phone. There was her, and there was the child inside her, and there was $1 folded in her coat pocket. She walked until her feet went numb. Then she walked some more. The town was called Milwater, and it sat at a bend in a wide, slow river. It had 2 streets that mattered and a few that didn't. Mara had grown up an hour south of it, but she had never walked it the way she was walking it now. She watched windows. She watched porches. She wondered which ones might open for her and which ones would not. Ray's Diner opened for her. Not because they knew her, because the door was unlocked and the bell above it rang, and the old man behind the counter looked up and saw a wet, shivering, pregnant girl and did what old men who have lived right tend to do. He pointed at a stool. He poured coffee. He slid a plate of toast across the counter without asking her to pay. His name was Walter. He did not ask her story. He watched her eat the toast, and he watched her hand shake when she lifted the cup, and he watched her hand settle again on her belly when she set the cup down. After a while he said quietly, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Mara did not answer. That was answer enough. Walter stood up and walked to a pin board by the door. He pulled off a piece of paper and laid it on the counter in front of her. The paper was faded and curling at the edges. It was a notice from the county. It listed 3 properties being auctioned off at the courthouse the next morning. Properties that had sat in limbo for so long nobody wanted them. The 3rd line said this: Old Ferryman's Hut, River Road, Parcel 14, condemned. Starting bid $1. Mara read the line twice. She looked up at Walter. Walter shrugged. "That place floods," he said. "Roof's half gone. No power. No well. The old ferryman died in there 42 years ago, and nobody has lived in it since. The county would love to be rid of it. $1 would do." Mara folded the paper and slid it into her coat pocket, next to the dollar. Walter said, "It is not much. But it is a deed. It is yours. Nobody can put you out of a thing that is in your name." Mara did not cry at the diner. She waited until she was outside, under the awning, with the rain coming down again and the streetlights turning the puddles to glass. Then she cried, but only for a minute. Then she wiped her face, and she walked to the courthouse, and she sat on the steps, and she waited for morning. She did not sleep much that night. She put her hand on her belly and she talked to the child. She told the child she had a plan now. She told the child it was not a good plan, but it was a plan, and that was something. That was more than she had an hour ago. By the time the sun came up, her plan had a name. The Old Ferryman's Hut. $1. Parcel 14. The courthouse opened at 8. The auction started at 9. There were 6 people in the room, not counting the clerk. 5 of them were there for the other 2 properties. One of them was there by accident. When the clerk called Parcel 14, the Old Ferryman's Hut, he called it 3 times. He looked around each time. He did not expect a hand. Mara raised her hand. The clerk squinted at her. He asked her to repeat her bid. $1, she said. There was a small, ugly laugh somewhere in the back of the room. A man in a brown jacket said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "She is buying a pile of rot." Somebody else said, "Let her have it. She can drown in it." The clerk did not laugh. The clerk had been doing his job long enough to know that when a young, pregnant woman in wet clothes bids $1 on a condemned property, she is not doing it for sport. He wrote her name on the line. He held out his hand. She put the $1 into it. Parcel 14, the clerk said. Sold. Mara Ellis. $1. He slid a set of papers across the counter. He slid a single iron key across with them. The key was long and old and heavier than Mara expected. She walked the 2 miles out to River Road. The man in the brown jacket drove past her, slowed down, rolled his window down, shook his head, drove on. Nobody else stopped. The hut sat by itself at the end of the road. The road stopped because the river started. The hut stood on short brick pilings at the edge of the bank, 30 feet from the water. It had been painted white once. Now it was mostly gray. The porch sagged on the left side. The roof had a patch of black where shingles had lifted and let the weather in. A faded sign above the door read Ferry. An older sign, hand-carved into the wood above that one, read Oscar Penrose. Mara put the key in the lock. The lock turned. The door swung in. The inside was smaller than she had feared and larger than she had hoped. One main room with a stone hearth. A side room with an iron bed frame and no mattress. A kitchen corner with a pump over a dry sink. The floor was planks of wide, dark wood. Some of them were loose. Some had warped up at the ends. It smelled like river and dust and time. She set her bags on the floor. She stood there for a long moment with her hand on her belly. Then she got to work. She cleaned for 2 days. She swept out 4 decades of leaves and mouse leavings and broken glass. She washed the hearth. She pumped the dry sink until rusty water came up, and then she pumped it more until the rust ran clear. She found a mattress bundled in a tarp in the back shed, beat it half to death for the dust, and dragged it in. Walter, bless him, brought a kettle, a stack of blankets, and a small bag of rice. He did not say much. He just put the things on the table and left. On the 3rd day, she started on the floor. There was one board in the main room, near the hearth, that rose up when she stepped on it. The nail heads on it were black with age. She pried it up with a crowbar Walter had dropped off with the other things. She meant only to reseat it and hammer it down. The board came up cleaner than she expected. Came up too clean. The nails underneath had been cut short on purpose a long time ago. The board had been made to lift. Under the board there was a second layer of wood. A thin panel. It had a small iron ring set into it. A recessed handle. She stared at it for a long time. She did not pull on the ring. Not yet. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the panel. She looked at her own hands, which were shaking. She looked out the open door at the river. She stood up. She walked outside. The sun was lower now. The river was moving slow and dark, the way rivers do in the late afternoon. She sat down on the top step of the porch. She held a tin mug of hot water in both hands. She had no tea. Hot water was enough. She breathed for a while. She did not think about the panel. She did not think about the iron ring. She watched the water. The baby kicked. A small, strong kick against the inside of her palm. She smiled. She had not smiled in a week. "I did it," she said out loud, to the baby, to herself, to the river. "I have a roof. It is a bad roof, but it is our roof. Nobody can take it. Nobody can shove me off it. Whatever is under that board has been under that board for 40 years. Can be under there one more night." She drank the hot water. She listened to the river. She felt the baby move again. For the first time in 8 months, Mara Ellis felt something close to safe. The knock came at dusk. 3 sharp raps. Not like Walter's knock. Walter knocked the way he did everything. Softly and only as much as was needed. These knocks were loud and careful and deliberate. Mara had just come back inside. The panel was still under the pried-up board. She had not lifted the ring. She had covered the gap loosely with a wool blanket because that felt right, though she could not have said why. She went to the door. She did not open it. "Who is it?" she said. A man's voice, smooth and low. "Miss Ellis. My name is Arnold Shaw. My associate is Mr. Braddock. We represent an estate with a prior interest in this property. We would like a brief word." Mara did not move. "An estate," she said. "Whose estate?" A long pause. "That is something we would prefer to discuss in private, Miss Ellis. May we come in?" "No," Mara said. Through the wood, she heard a second voice. Harder. Clipped. That one said, "We can come back with papers." The first voice cut in, smoother again. "What Mr. Braddock means is that there may be a legal claim on items inside this property. We have an obligation to make sure those items are protected. 10 minutes. We will not touch anything." Mara kept her voice steady. "The property was auctioned off yesterday. I have the deed. I have the key. You do not. Miss Ellis, you are a young woman. You are, I believe, expecting. We want to avoid any unpleasantness. Open the door. Please." She did not open the door. She stood behind it with one hand on her belly and her other hand on the iron latch. And she said nothing, and she waited. After a long minute, a card slid under the door. Heavy cream-colored cardstock. Black lettering. Shaw and Braddock, Legal Services, with an address 200 miles away in a city she had only heard of on the news. A car door slammed. Then another. An engine started. Tires pulled away across gravel. Mara stood behind the door and counted to 100 before she moved. Then she moved fast. She tore the wool blanket off the pried-up board. She knelt down on the floor. She hooked her finger into the iron ring. She pulled. The panel came up easy. Too easy. The hinges underneath were new. Newer than 40 years anyway, or kept oiled by somebody who had cared about them a lot. Under the panel was a square black hole in the floor, maybe 3 feet across. And going down into the hole, bolted to the side of a dry, clean wall, was a wooden ladder. Mara stared into the hole. She did not think. If she had thought, she might not have gone. Instead, she lit the oil lamp Walter had left her, hooked the handle on her forearm, and climbed down. It was not deep. 8 rungs. Her feet touched a dry wooden floor. She raised the lamp. The cellar was small, 8 feet by 10. The walls were lined with tar paper and what looked like oilcloth. The air was dry and cool and smelled faintly of cedar. Somebody had built this room to last. Along one wall, 3 leather satchels sat on a low shelf. Beside them, stacked too high, were 4 wooden crates. On top of the crates was something flat wrapped in brown paper and twine. Leaning in the far corner was a long, narrow bundle, wrapped in canvas. Mara set the lamp down on the floor. She opened the first satchel. Inside were coins. Hundreds of coins. They were not American. They had foreign writing on them and profiles of kings and emperors. Most were gold. She knew gold when she saw it. She had pawned her grandmother's ring once, when she was 19, and the jeweler had shown her what gold looked like up close. These coins looked like that. Heavy. Warm-colored. Real. Her hands started shaking. She closed the satchel. She opened one of the crates. The top held a long flat tray. The tray was full of bundled letters, tied with string, each bundle labeled with a name. Weiss, Klein, Rosenthal, Vogel. Names she did not know. Names that were not from this town or this county or this country. Under the tray, a layer of folded documents. Papers with stamps and seals. Photographs. Small, stiff, sepia photographs of families. Under the photographs, a velvet-lined box. Inside the box, a small medal on a red ribbon. Inside the box also a ring. A wedding ring, thin, gold. Engraved on the inside in a language she could not read. Mara sat back on her heels on the dry wooden floor of the cellar. She held the ring in her palm. She did not cry. She was beyond crying. She looked at the ring and at the coins and at the names written on the letters, and she understood, without understanding any of the details, that she had stepped into the middle of somebody else's history, and that the somebody else was dead, and that their history had been waiting under this hut for 40 years for somebody to find it. And she understood one other thing. Shaw and Braddock knew, or they suspected, and they were not finished with her. If you are still with me on this story, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happens next is where this story stops being about a hut and starts being about a fight over what was hidden inside it. Mara climbed back up the ladder with the ring still in her fist. The second knock came in the morning. This time there were 3 of them. Shaw, Braddock, and a man in a brown sheriff's uniform with a star on his chest and an uncomfortable look on his face. Mara opened the door. She had not slept. The ring was on a leather cord around her neck, under her shirt. The panel in the floor was back in place. The board was nailed down again. She had done it in the dark, by lamplight, her belly in the way of every swing of the hammer. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Mara Ellis. I am Sheriff Doyle. These gentlemen have filed a claim of concealed assets. They say there may be items inside this residence that belong to their client. I am required by law to conduct a walkthrough." Mara looked at the sheriff for a long second. Then she said, "I need 10 minutes. I need to make a phone call." Shaw smiled a thin, patient smile. "Miss Ellis," he said, "I do not think a phone call is going to be necessary." Doyle held up a hand. 10 minutes is fine," he said. "Ma'am, you go ahead." Mara walked to Ray's diner. She walked fast. She walked the way women walk when there is a child inside them and something very important outside them. When she pushed open the diner door, Walter was already behind the counter. He took one look at her face. He said, "They came, didn't they?" She told him in 3 sentences. The men. The sheriff. The 10 minutes. She did not tell him about the ring or the coins. She was saving that. She was not sure for what. Walter took off his apron. He said, "We walk back together. And on the way you tell me what is under that floor." By the time they reached the hut, Walter knew. He had listened. He had not interrupted. He had only gone very quiet, the way old men go quiet when something they had heard about long ago turns out to be true. Sheriff Doyle was standing on the porch. Shaw and Braddock were standing in the yard. None of them looked happy to see an old man walk up with Mara. Walter walked past all of them into the hut, without asking. He had taught high school history in this county for 40 years, and Sheriff Doyle had been his student, and Sheriff Doyle did not stop him. Walter knelt by the hearth. He asked Mara to lift the board. She did. He asked her to open the panel. She did. He asked her to hand him one of the letter bundles from the crate below. She climbed down. She came back up with a bundle. The name on the string said Weiss. Walter untied it with hands that were not as steady as they usually were. He read the top letter without speaking. Then the next. Then the next. Then he looked up at Shaw. "Your client," he said. "Which family?" Shaw did not hesitate. "Vogel," he said. Walter nodded, slowly. He reached down into the crate again. He came up with a second bundle. Vogel, the string read. He opened it. He read. He spoke to the sheriff, not to Shaw. "Sheriff Doyle," he said. "These letters and the documents beneath them tell a story. The man who lived in this hut was named Oscar Penrose. He ran the ferry across this river for 60 years. In the 40s and in the years after the 40s, he ferried people across that nobody else would ferry. Jewish families, refugees, people without papers, people who had lost countries. They came through this town at night, and Oscar took them across. They paid him when they could, and when they couldn't, they left him things. Things they could not carry. Things they would come back for one day if they lived." Walter held up the Vogel bundle. "The Vogel family he is claiming to represent," Walter said, "died at Auschwitz. All of them. I have a letter here in this bundle from Hannah Vogel, asking Oscar to give her cousin's ring to a girl named Leah Becker if Hannah did not return. Hannah did not return. Leah did not return. There is no surviving Vogel that matches this man's client. There cannot be." Shaw's mouth had gone thin. Doyle turned to him. "Mr. Shaw," he said, "I believe we are done." Shaw tried to speak. Doyle cut him off. "You are going to walk off this property now. You are going to get in that car. If I see you on this road again without a real warrant, we are going to have a different kind of conversation." Shaw walked. Braddock walked with him. The car doors slammed. The engine turned over. The gravel ground under the tires. Then it was quiet. Mara sat down on the floor of the hut. Right there, beside the open panel. She put her face in her hands. Walter sat down beside her, slowly, the way old men sit. "Oscar," he said, "kept this safe for 42 years. You," he said, "kept it safe for 3 days. You did better than any of us." News of what was in the hut did not reach the town right away. Walter wanted it that way. He called a friend at the State University. The friend called the Historical Society. The Historical Society called a museum in the city. People in suits came out to the hut again, but this time they were different people. They were quiet and they were careful, and they wore soft white gloves when they lifted the letters out of the crates. It took 9 weeks to catalog everything. There were 11 satchels of coins. There were 237 letters. There were 41 photographs. There were 9 pieces of jewelry, 3 medals, a pair of violins in the canvas bundle, and 1 small oil painting that had been rolled up and kept dry for 4 decades because Oscar Penrose had built a cellar the way a man builds an ark. Where the museum could find descendants, the items went to descendants. A grandson in Chicago received his grandmother's wedding ring. A great-niece in Tel Aviv received a bundle of letters she read and then could not speak for 2 days. A family in Montreal received a violin. There were more, many more. Where the museum could not find descendants, the items went to the museum, with Oscar's name on the card beside them, and a small line below his name. Fairyman, Milwater, 1919 to 1984. He carried strangers across. And where an item had no descendant and no historical home, the law in that state provided for a finder's share. Not all of what was in the cellar. A portion. Enough for Mara Ellis, 21 years old, 7 months pregnant when she bought that hut for $1, to never have to sleep in the rain again. Lila Ellis was born on a cold, bright morning in April. Walter drove Mara to the hospital himself. He paced in the waiting room like it was his own grandchild being born, and when the nurse came out and told him mother and baby were both fine, Walter sat down on a plastic chair and did not stand up again for 10 minutes. The people who had laughed at the auction did not come by the hut. Most of them. The man in the brown jacket from the courthouse came once. He stood at the edge of the yard and he turned his hat in his hands. He said, "Miss Ellis, I owe you an apology." Mara did not make it easy for him. She did not make it hard either. She nodded once, and she said, "Thank you for coming," and she went back inside. She spent the next year fixing the hut. She did not turn it into a mansion. She did not want one. She put a new roof on it. She had the porch rebuilt so it would not sag. She had the pump replaced. She had power run out from the road. She kept the hearth. She kept the wide dark floorboards, though she had one board in the main room replaced with a new one, and under the new board she put nothing at all, because she did not want anyone to ever lift it looking for something again. Above the door, she kept the old carved sign, Oscar Penrose. She polished it. She hung beside it a small brass plaque, cut by a man 2 towns over who did not ask questions. The plaque said this: "In memory of Oscar Penrose, ferryman. He carried strangers to safety. 1919 to 1984. Mara read it out loud the day it went up. She read it to Lila, who was too small to understand, and to Walter, who understood everything, and to the river. On the day Lila turned 1 year old, it rained. Mara stood on the porch of the hut with her daughter in her arms. She stood on the porch that had been rebuilt. She kept one hand on the railing. She watched the rain come down on the river and turn the river gray. She thought about another porch, a porch in another town, a porch she had been shoved off of 18 months earlier by a woman who had decided she was not worth keeping. She thought about the duffel bags hitting the grass. She thought about the sound of the lock turning behind her. She did not feel angry. She did not feel triumphant either. She felt something quieter than both of those things. She felt like a woman who had been told, a long time ago, that she had nothing, and who now knew the truth. She had never had nothing. She had always had her own 2 feet. She had always had the child inside her. And it turned out, she had always had people like Walter, waiting in warm diners with free toast, and people like Oscar Penrose, long dead, whose kindness had been waiting under a floor for her to find it. Lila made a small happy sound in her arms. Mara kissed the top of her daughter's head. She did not go back inside right away. She stood on her own porch on her own land, in the rain, and she watched the river move, slow and dark and steady, the way rivers do, the way they always have, the way they always will. Nobody was going to shove her off this porch. Nobody ever would again.